Welcome everyone to our second panel as part of this jaw-dropping summit today. And let me have the pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-chair, Sophia Yaliraki, Professor of Theoretical Chemistry here in this building, and also the founding director of DigiFab, which looks at the next way and next generation of developing and designing drugs and other biomaterials.
I guess you already had an introduction. Professor Aldo Faisal, whose paper was mentioned before, is a professor of AI and neuroscience in computing and bioengineering, and he's one of the UKRI Turing Fellows with interests in many areas, including healthcare.
And we want to talk to you about AI for good business. So how does this link into life sciences? Well, first of all, I think there's a life science revolution and there's an AI revolution going on at the same time. In this panel, we want to focus on the impact that AI has on life sciences, but also broader implications for society. And of course, life sciences are tied to, we hear examples about AI for drug discovery, but actually there's a lot more that AI can do for the entire pharmaceutical industry, for example. And in fact, Imperial business partners have just published a report on AI and pharmaceuticals industry where we have uncovered some of the things that many people overlook, and you can find it, for example, in my LinkedIn feed. And beyond that, of course, there's the NHS, this fantastic organization, the largest data generation system in the world for healthcare data. And of course, also with NHS, we're doing this collaboration very closely here at Imperial, here at White City, with, for example, the UKRI AI Center and AI for Healthcare, where we've deployed a lot of technologies, some of which were mentioned. So there's tight links between AI and healthcare, but I think there's more to AI that we should discover and touch upon today. And so I'm delighted that we have three expert panelists, and I'm going to start at the far end with Neil Lawrence, who's the DeepMind professor at the University of Cambridge. For the machine learners among you, he's the person who brought Gaussian processes to the masses, and he's really a thinker in the field. Next we have
Dr. Anjali Mazumder, who is the theme lead for AI and Justice and Human Rights at the Alan Turing Institute, and has pioneered what we want to be discussing here today, how we can be responsibly thinking about these new technologies.
And the whole thing cannot work without the important side of the world that actually takes products, business, and technologies forward. And so we're delighted to have Eleanor McLaurin. So she's an expert in tying together AI technologies and regulatory affairs together so we can actually deploy these products and, for example, prescribe them in the NHS.
So we are absolutely honored and delighted to have each one of you, and I think touching in the different aspects of what we are trying to bring here today, which is how innovations in the university can translate in business, but also impact government policy and our everyday life. And I think with that, we want to start with a specific question to start this discussion.
So we asked you to prepare a 2-minute statement that I'm rigorously timing with my fingers. And I'm again going to start from the far end with Neil.
So, prepare. If I prepare, then I would be longer than 2 minutes. But sometimes if I don't prepare, I'd be longer than 2 minutes. So I'll try and be short. I think that the really interesting challenge that I'd like to sort of open with is the pervasiveness of AI technologies and the inappropriateness of most of the ways we respond to innovation. It's not the same as graphene or anything else. It's much more like the first days of computer science. And so what I love is this quote from Robert Solow that I think is about 1986, which is, "I see computers everywhere apart from in the productivity statistics." So my modern quote is, "I see AI everywhere apart from in the productivity statistics." And the reason that happens, I think, so I characterize it two ways. There's two ways in which AI can be good for business. And in 1986, I was sitting there programming a BBC B computer while I was actually playing the game of Elite all the time because the computer games industry launched, which is, to a large extent, the reason we could all video conference each other during the pandemic, because the amount of Xbox data moving around the internet is way larger than the amount of video conferencing data that moves around the internet. So there's an extraordinary thing that happens. You get greenfield research, things that people didn't envisage. And then there's a question mark around about all those sort of things that we traditionally consider productive, like supply chain or manufacturing or the life sciences. And I would call that brownfield innovation. And it's orders of magnitude harder. So no one asked for ChatGPT. No one asked for foundation models. We have surveys and questions when we said, what would you like AI to do? And the one thing the public said, this is done with the Royal Society sort of review about 7 years ago, everyone said, we don't want it to be creative. That's the last thing we want it to do. We would like it to help doctors. We would like it to make the society more efficient. We would like it to make society more equal, all of which are extremely hard, and none of these recent breakthroughs will do. It's not that I'm against them. They're exciting, but they are not going to affect many of the problems we face. And I think that so the AI is like the computer in that way, and we'll only know it's successful when we stop saying AI, because we don't say computers all the time nowadays. I probably overran.
Awesome.
But I'll stop there.
AI, perfect timing. Anjali.
So I'll share a little bit more of the personal journey on this, is that I came from the field of statistics, and I got into it using John Tukey's sort of famous thing of, statistics kind of gives you the chance to play in everyone else's backyard. And so it's given me the opportunity to work across sort of health, education, justice, as sort of in its broadest sense. And through that, I sort of had this journey of also, I wanted to look at how it could help to build tools that would support from a decision support perspective. That was my initial kind of area of it. And what I also found through each of my kind of experiences was that there was, as technology was developing and you had the opportunity to sort of ingest more and more data and people were getting excited that you could collect and you could use this data, there's also this question about, actually, is all that data really needed? So yes, there's questions of quality, but also you may not need to. And that really started to get into the issues around the human rights and kind of law issues of both bias and privacy, but data minimization, and really how much do we actually need? And increasingly into these areas of, well, if we are needing to, if we see a real business need or science need to ingest all this data, then how do we do that in a way that is protecting and respecting human rights? So whether that's privacy or non-discrimination or any of the other kind of fundamental rights that comes through. And increasingly that's been, for me, that's been around working on sort of societal challenges where the interest is to bring data, often sensitive data that is siloed, sitting across sectors, not just organizations within the public sector, but actually across public, private, and nonprofit sector. And so recognizing, so what is the value of data, but also really when it's combined and that potential power, but also risk. And so it's this dual sort of issue that we have around the ramifications of potentially bringing together these data sets, combined, balancing that with the power that it potentially has, whether that's around life-changing, life-saving measures to any other kind of area. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Anjali. Eleanor, how do we take this into the real life of the business world?
Yes, so I work for an organization that leverages AI for specific use cases within life sciences. And I guess in answer to the question, is it good for business? I think absolutely, but I think to some of the points made here, not necessarily on its own. I think as an enabler you mentioned is really the perfect point. And I do think that, of course, it goes hand in hand with data and the quality of the data, the standardization of the data as to how effective that AI can be. We, for example, at my organization, innovated about 20 years ago electronic data capture. So we were one of the first EDC platforms, for those who know what that is, capturing electronic case report forms in an electronic format. And really the goal at that point was to create organized operational efficiency. But what we found is because that technology was so widely adopted, we have this huge amount of data, and I think there were some discussions around responsibility. We now realize that we have these very, very powerful insights that we can get that can completely transform the way that clinical trials are run. So I guess in summary, I don't know, probably went over 2 minutes. Yes, it's good for business. It's not necessarily on its own.
Thank you very much. I think the interesting thing about these, what is good for business, and our thinking about other things aside the maximization of profit, does that make good business, is always highlighted when you see these beautiful business school reports where you see large studies on companies and you find, for example, companies that do a lot in social good or that do a lot for sustainability are also typically companies that perform very well economically. And the question is, how is it looking with performing in the AI domain? And there's this beautiful study by the London Stock Exchange Group where they asked CEOs at the London Stock Exchange where they're seeing themselves in AI, and 90% answered that they're leaders. And then they asked the same companies, head of data science or head of AI, and 15% thought they were leaders in the field. So I think there's a disconnect sometimes between actual capability and desired management capabilities. So taking it from there, we were thinking to pop the ChatGPT question, because I think it's in many people's mind, ChatGPT being a chatbot that allows, that can generate fairly elaborate answers. You can pass, many exam questions these days with a ChatGPT answer, at least at a 2 to 1 level. And how is this revolution that some people now think only started the other week when ChatGPT was released, how is this now going to impact how we do business, how we do research? And maybe we start with Eleanor on this.
Good question. Again, I think it's an incredibly useful and exciting tool. I think there are obviously concerns around how that then gets used, and that's really a sort of human intervention question. So I think certainly from a technology perspective, it presents a lot of positive possibilities, but who's going to then regulate that and ensure that those responses are not introducing bias or issues that you would get with, frankly, human responses potentially as well. So I don't think there's I think it's a positive development in general. I think the question is, how do we then regulate that, and how do we use it, and where is the line drawn? Yes, maybe kids shouldn't be running their entire exams through it. It's not necessarily going to lead to an enlightened population. But, in terms of the technology itself, I think it's very cool.
I think there's already been interventions. Many schools have already said they will not set essays at home. The kids will have to write the essays in school. And also there's already people saying there is bias, political bias, already in there. But I'll let Anjali carry on.
I think I did exams at school where we had to write things.
I mean, I guess certainly there's we're seeing already in the educational sector that it has become a challenge to sort of see how you could better potentially actually support what you can do with it, but also to again hold students and others, kind of accountable to what they're producing, and to support that. But I think there's the liability. I think there's a broader kind of risk and opportunity there in terms of, from a fundamental kind of rights perspective, there's the opportunity to actually enjoy in scientific progress and to have authorship on all of those accounts. Those are actual rights that we do have. And so now those things are shifting, both with ChatGPT and sort of broader other foundation models that are being developed. And so those are I think the considerations that need to be thought of, especially if they start to get implemented in business and you're building it off of business practices. And I think that's where we haven't quite got into our understanding. And that's where I think that sometimes we get into conversations about the law hasn't caught up, or even ethics hasn't caught up. And some of it is just actually it's siloed. So yes, there's been technological advances. But it's also the interpretation of the law and how we best then protect workers, protect organizations, and make the best use of technology and hold respective organizations and actors to account. That was a waffly full answer there.
I guess, it's so nice to be with Eleanor and Anjali to hear different perspectives, because I think the more you sort of try and learn about these things, the more you realize you don't know things, and actually other people know things. I'm not sure whether ChatGPT knows things. One of my favorite things is working with people. And I like it because I like their stories and the things they do and the things they're fascinated about. And I guess ChatGPT is giving the sense you're working with a person. Well, you're clearly not. You're working with an interpolation between what people have thought. And I'm very curious at which point it becomes like the fascination we all had when we first got Alexa or whatever, the assistant, or Siri, or whatever it was, that quickly turns into frustration of this is a pretty irritating thing, that at least I don't have to switch on the radio now, I can just tell Alexa to play it. And I suspect something will happen similar with this technology. And I think when you look at what's going to happen is very, very interesting. And I think the best you can do is try and look at historical precedent. And my favorite historical precedent is coming from just a story of someone I'm trying to work with at the moment who's a sort of Assyriologist working on cuneiform. And it's so interesting hearing what happened in 3000 BC when, first of all, people could do exactly what I'm doing now, writing notes. And you didn't have to remember stories. You didn't have to remember the Epic of Gilgamesh, have someone specialized to tell it. You could actually write it down on clay tablets. What a revolution that would have been. Must have blown people's minds when they saw it. In fact, in every other society where writing's introduced, it starts as religious. Whereas in that society, it started as an accounting technology that became poetry. Every other society, it becomes religion right from the beginning because it's so mind-blowing. And I think there's a lot in that, because then what happened from that is the scribes dominated those societies because the scribes had control over writing. And writing, in many cases, stayed very, very complex. It stayed complex, like hieroglyphs, and controlled by the people who wanted to control the population. And we were somehow lucky because it came to us, to the Phoenicians, who were traders. And so they got a simplified version. So our scripts were very simple right from the start in Europe. And there's an argument that that's kind of what's happening with ChatGPT, that we've seen this process that took 1,000 years as you go, or longer, because this is all, for the Greeks, this would be ancient history. By the time they're writing, there's 2,000 years when the Sumerians have created this stuff. And I think that there's really rich lessons there in terms of it starts as an accounting tool that becomes a tool for poets. And what's happened in a very compressed period of time is potentially ChatGPT is now a tool for poets. And I have no idea what that means. But it's going to be enormously disruptive. And the other precedent I'd like to put in there is the printing press. Because, of course, what did the printing press do? Well, it led to almost 500 years unbroken of war in Europe as people learned new stuff. And so I think that it's going to be, these technologies are enormously disruptive. Anything that is dealing with communication and facilitating communication will do things that are very, very difficult to predict. And they'll both be positive and negative. And we have to have good conversations involving a broad range of people to try and work out what do we do about it. And I'll stop there because I don't know yet what we do about it.
Great. Well, I think let's stay on the tricky bits. And by the way, some of these questions may or may not have been generated by ChatGPT. I'm telling you. But let's look back at business. And patents are essential for business, especially in life sciences and biotech. And now the challenge is patents require some form of inventive step. That's sort of some stroke of genius that is not just an expert applying their standard knowledge to combine things. But of course, these experts can use better and better technologies. And if AI systems can help you search molecular spaces to find new drug combinations automatically, any student can start developing and discovering drugs. If you have proposals being combined from different fields by ChatGPT, you may have new technologies that any engineer can create suddenly. So do you think we're at risk of losing the definition of the patent because we lose inventive steps?
I guess we'll start
with Eleanor.
It's a great question, firstly, whether yours or ChatGPT's. I think I have to think about that. Do we lose some of the, if ultimately, if I think about the business that I'm in, and really our goal is to get treatments to patients that are sick and to get them there as quickly as possible, anything that helps speed that up and lower risk is a positive thing, I think, right? I guess in terms of the question of patents, I don't know that it necessarily does minimize the risk of patents. I mean, I guess there's a philosophical question to ask, well, if you can pay for technologies and therefore, find these scientific discoveries, then are we creating some kind of bias there that it then becomes whoever can afford that technology? I think there's a question mark over that. But from my perspective in terms of what I do, I think anything that helps us, again, get to those decisions quicker and is more sustainable and helps those patients quicker is a positive thing. So I don't know that I'm really answering the question here, but it's a tough one. So I'm going to throw it over to you.
I'm going to just wait for Anjali. I'm not sure that I have an answer to this question either. So I guess a couple of things to potentially consider is that there is a risk with any of, I think, these models that are being developed, including ChatGPT, that they're automating something, right? So they're taking away potentially the opportunity of creativeness and that individual creativeness. But you can argue that, yes, it's automating certain things that could be helpful that are potentially easier done. But there's, I think there is the autonomy, the creativeness that is potentially being missed, even if there is the opportunity that you could still add to ChatGPT or any other kind of AI model, foundation model, and do something more creative with it. So, I think there's there's the two elements to it, and I guess, about whether or not it risks patents, I think is also, there's the part where fundamentally it might, in terms of how the law interprets that, there's specific issues around it, and that's going to be an interpretation issue in the courts, which we haven't quite hit at this point, which will be interesting. It's kind of been raised too about training models and who owns that and how the law responds to that. So things that are getting used and reused, we still haven't really seen how the courts are going to really handle that.
But there's still creativity, right? And even if you're speeding up a process, there's still creativity in how you train those algorithms, how you understand how to then further develop those molecules. So I feel a little conflicted about it. I don't know that, because if you think about it, you could, the point that I made earlier was, are we creating bias because someone can afford these softwares? Well, are we creating bias because someone can afford a better education, right? Or more access to knowledge somehow. So, I think it's how it gets applied, and I think it will change the way that people, look at how certain processes are done, and that will make space for additional creativity. Sorry, I had that thought.
No, it's good. That's perfect. I think the example I wanted to bring up was what happened in databases. So, you get the situation where companies own data, and I mean that's kind of an odd situation. And I'm not an expert. I've tried to understand what's going on here because you can't actually copyright facts. So there's this sort of interesting thing. So data is I think, by lawyers broadly considered facts. I think people who work with data are not so sure about that, but it is considered as facts. And I think what happened in the 1990s, that certainly in the UK and the US, I'm not sure this is true in Europe, when it came to people wanted an ecosystem of databases, you need financial incentive to create databases, because curation of data is quite a lot of work. This is still a problem we haven't resolved today. To me, this is a massive problem. And so the sort of innovation they introduced was that, because I think for copyright, there has to be some creative step, and it's sort of interesting. So what does that mean? But the funny one is that they decided that the creation of a database schema was a creative step. So if you don't know what a database is, creating a schema is a really boring thing that you have to do where you're just sort of describing what each column contains. You have to tell the computer this contains numbers which have floating points. This other column contains a small text field. This column contains a password. It's a sort of highly tedious, it's the sort of thing that, you know, people expect, oh, we have this world of computers and they're going to make the world less tedious for us. But the truth is, because we're the flexible ones, it makes our world more tedious because we have to spend all our time converting things into language the computer can understand. So it's that type of tedium doing this. And they decided that was a creative step. And they decided it not because someone said, oh, it's the same as creating music or painting. They said, oh, well, because if we don't incentivize the creation of databases in some way, people won't be able to charge for it. And so this is a historical decision from the 1990s, as best as I can understand. I wasn't involved in the debate. And now we're faced with the same type of decisions. And I think it really does, you know, and Aldo mentioned patents, and patents emerge from letters patent, from the ability of the king to decide who the weaving guild will be in the city of Birmingham, who owns the monopoly, right? So they emerge from these sort of existing technologies. These existing sort of regulatory mechanisms, I should say. And I think that the reason patents came out is because people didn't want people to keep things secret, right? So because you had two ways, you could do something secretly, you could have a secret way of producing something, and that was felt to be bad for society. So a patent allows you to tell everyone what you're doing and have at a period of time when you have a monopoly on it, which is a sort of really interesting idea. I'm not sure that's how any of these things are being wielded today. But what I like about all these technologies is they cause you to ask the question, what is the fundamental purpose of intellectual property? What do we consider creativity? What do we consider it 50 years ago? What do we consider it today? I think the difficulty is, and you know, like anyone who's worked on computer software will understand this difficulty, is you now have to patch the regulation. We have a regulation like, you know, MS-DOS with Windows 3.1 on top of it and then Windows 95 that is building on an underlying structure. You're not allowed to, for very, very good reasons, throw that all away and say, well, let's start again with whatever current Windows is, XP. You know, you can't do that because everything has to be backward compatible. And I mean, it's true for so many of the levers that we would like to use in this space that, like, we wouldn't have built it this way if we'd known what was going to happen. But by the same token, you know, that's where we are. So I think it's really difficult. But I really I delight in the way it asks these fundamental questions about what we think creativity is, which Eleanor was already sort of just exploring, I think. Yeah.
I think you brought, each one of you, all these issues we've all been grappling with, right? We do need to create databases for the problems we are working on, and we do need to give credit to each of the people who are working on. And also, I think fundamentally, we all want to keep humanity being what makes us human, which is the process of how we experience creativity ourselves and not outsource that to a machine. So I guess with the way things are moving so quickly, do you think that we have left the law, the way companies respond, or what we should be doing behind? And should we be perhaps thinking about how to bring all of this together in some way?
But I think where we question creativity, I mean, for a software developer or a database producer, you know, creating that content in a particular way is arguably no different to creating a poem, right? It's the way the world has moved, and it's, you know, something that needs to be done. And when you think about how AI works, I mean, you're training it like a human, like a child. And the way that you do that is really important, right? The way that you create those algorithms is going to be based on sort of people's opinions and levels of ability. And that can be arguably a creative process.
I just thought on the bringing it together, I think you were going, Anjali, I'll let you, did you want to come?
No.
I think you're hinting at I mean, it's all very well blathering on about cuneiform printing presses and copyright, but what do we actually do? And that's what policymakers have to decide. And I think when you look at the landscape, there's quite important, difficult questions around how do we get leverage and understanding on this rapidly and convene the type of conversations we need to have that aren't of the form of pub conversations that come out with a sort of, which many academic conversations are actually. I mean, almost all academic conversations are like pub conversations. You know, we don't actually do anything afterwards. how do we actually convert that into a sort of developed? Well, that's the beauty of being an academic, you know.
Don't advocate for yourself. Going on soon.
You know, these things have consequences, and it's what's clear is that, like, we don't really have the pathway from understanding the capability. It's really odd because everyone's going, oh, big tech's doing this. No, all of this comes out of academia. Let's be very clear. All of this comes from academia. It does not come from Google. They've got the money and all that sort of stuff. But all these advances are coming from an academic community that thought interesting things that they were told was useless for a number of years. Now, the people who are then capitalizing on that are companies with large amounts of money, right? So the interesting question is, how do we get the leverage back so we're getting the academics back involved in that conversation?
Yeah,
sorry, I'll stop.
No, please continue, because this is exactly right. And we talked a lot about talent, and actually, as an alumnus and a person from Kendall Square, I can tell you what made it Kendall Square was the talent, and what we want to create here is talent. But talent is fostered at universities, and it's running away from us. So please, go ahead.
Well, and I think one of the first things I'm thinking, one of the things we stop doing is bickering between ourselves as universities about who should get what money and try and work together better to come out with a coherent plan, particularly in this country, because we're being told we have to become a science superpower, right? And yet the bit that no one ever says is, yeah, you have to do it on a budget. We're going to do it like, you know, look at the other science superpowers, and they're all getting 100 million for everything. You know, you name something and you get 100 million. You know, 100 million to us is just an enormous amount of money. And you sort of look at that and think, well, that's clearly not going to work, because if you're going to try and play the same game, we're just going to lose, because it's a game of resource. But if you look at this country and you look at our capabilities, and you look at things like the NHS that Aldo mentioned, and you look at the fact that we're geographically quite well connected, and that we have a diversity, we have diversities of types of people, we have a diversity of universities in different locations that are geographically interconnected. Culture changes very quickly as you move across the UK. That's a tremendously powerful thing. And if we can do something about that to work together and bring all the regions involved and have a conversation that's proper national conversation, not restricted to Imperial, UCL, Cambridge, and Oxford, you know, then I think that we can really do exciting things. But the first thing we have to do as academics is sort of stop with this sort of like, no, it's my money, it's your money, you know, all that sort of thing, which actually is quite damaging. But the next thing we have to do is work out, well, how do we have a conversation around actually getting access to these technologies? Because although they started in academia, to build them now costs an enormous amount of money. And I think one problem there is you could say, well, do we build one nationally or whatever else? But it's such a rapidly fluctuating situation. So we don't, you know, OpenAI have released this. Who's going to release what? Will someone open source one of these soon? I mean, but we do sort of have to bring people to have a conversation so we're ready for what to do next. I don't know, I'll stop there, I've gone on too long.
We ran out of time and we answered more, we raised more questions than answers, but I think this is because this was an incredibly successful panel, and I really, on behalf of both of us, thank you enormously for your time and effort, and all of you for your questions, and thank you very much.